An elderly man, thinking his son was taking him to a nursing home, steps out of the car only to be completely stunned. Morales, a 72-year-old widower, sat quietly in his small room in Austin, Texas, gazing out the window at the bustling city streets below. He had always been a man of pride, a man who valued his independence, but now his body had grown weaker, his memory hazier, and his heart heavier, living with his son Alejandro and daughter-in-law Mariana. Roberto felt like a shadow of the man he used to be. Roberto had a plan. He had decided he no longer wanted to be a burden. The guilt gnawed at him every time he saw the grandson's room. He now occupied the quick goodbyes his family gave before heading to work, and the meals delivered by Teresa, their neighbor. The idea of moving to a nursing home seemed less like an exile and more like a relief for everyone, but beneath his stoic exterior, Roberto longed for something he couldn't name. He didn't just feel forgotten, he felt unnecessary. Roberto's life hadn't always been this way. His mind often drifted back to San Antonio, where he and his late wife, Sophia, built a life together in their small wooden home. Sophia had brought warmth to his world, her laughter echoing in every corner of their house. Roberto had adopted Alejandro when he married Sophia. The boy wasn't his by blood, but from the first moment Alejandro called him Papa, Roberto had vowed to give him everything. Together they turned a modest home into a sanctuary filled with love, hard work, and simple joys. Roberto had been a man of the land, tending to his garden with the help of Palomo, his loyal horse, but all of that changed the night of the fire. One evening, Roberto lit a candle to fight the dark when power outage left his home without light. Exhausted from a day of harvesting potatoes with Palomo, he fell asleep on the sofa. By the time he woke, the air was thick with smoke. Neighbors broke down the door, dragging him to safety, but the house, his memories, Sophia's belongings, and their shared life was reduced to ashes when Roberto woke in the hospital. 24 days later, the doctors told him he had been lucky to survive, but he didn't feel lucky. He felt empty. When Alejandro brought him to Austin to recover, Roberto left not only his home behind, but also a piece of his soul. Life in Alejandro's home wasn't what Roberto had hoped. Alejandro and Mariana were busy with work and seemed distant, leaving Teresa, the neighbor, to care for his meals and needs. Though kind, Teresa didn't hold back her opinions. "They don't want you here, Roberto," she said one day, shaking her head. "It's the same everywhere. Once we get old, our children don't want to deal with us." Her words haunted him. On his birthday, Roberto sat alone with a slice of cake Teresa had left him. Alejandro and Mariana had wished him well that morning, but didn't stay to celebrate. The loneliness was suffocating. Roberto couldn't take it any longer. One evening he cornered Alejandro. "Take me to a nursing home," he said firmly. "Sell my land in San Antonio. Use the money to pay for it. I don't want to be a burden to you or Mariana anymore, Papa, not now." Alejandro replied with a sigh, "We'll talk about it later. I've had a long day." Roberto's frustration boiled over. "If you won't do it, I'll find a nursing home myself." Alejandro simply patted his shoulder and walked away, leaving Roberto feeling more invisible than ever. Days led into weeks, and Roberto's pleas to be taken to a nursing home seemed to vanish into thin air. Each night he sat at the edge of his bed staring at the worn photograph of Sophia he kept tucked in his wallet, whispering apologies to her for the burden he had become. His heart felt heavier with every passing day, the silence in Alejandro and Mariana's home amplifying his loneliness. Then on a bright Saturday morning, everything changed. Alejandro walked into Roberto's room carrying a crisp white shirt, a pair of neatly folded slacks, and a new set of toiletries. Mariana followed with fresh towels and sheets tucked under her arm. Pack your things, Papa, Alejandro said, his voice steady but unreadable. We going on a trip? Roberto froze, his hands trembling as he clutched the photograph. The words echoed in his ears, filling him with a bittersweet mix of relief and sorrow. Finally, he thought, they're taking me. He nodded silently, not daring to meet Alejandro's eyes, afraid that he might see pity or worse, guilt. He packed quickly, methodically folding his few clothes with precision. His heart ached as he placed Sophia's photograph on top of the pile, zipping the suitcase with a finality that felt like a goodbye. The car ride began in silence, the hum of the engine the only sound. Roberto sat in the back seat, clutching his suitcase tightly, his knuckles white. Alejandro drove, his eyes fixed on the road, while Mariana stared out the window, a small smile playing at her lips. To Roberto, her smile felt out of place, a hint of joy on what he believed was meant to be a somber day. As they left Austin city limits, the towering skyscrapers and bustling streets gave way to rolling hills and sprawling farmland. The scenery seemed to blur together, but to Roberto, every detail stood out vividly. The weathered fences lining the road, the clusters of wild flowers dotting the fields, the occasional old oak tree standing tall against the sky. The sights reminded him of his younger days, of drives with Sophia through the countryside, their laughter filling the air as they imagined growing old. Together, Roberto's thoughts drifted further into the past. He remembered Sophia's laugh, the way it bubbled out of her when he told one of his terrible jokes. He remembered Alejandro's first steps, how his little boy had stumbled and fallen into his arms, his giggles echoing through their home. And he remembered his garden in San Antonio, the rich earthy smell of freshly turned soil, as he and Paloma worked side by side to nurture their crops. He let out a shaky sigh, his eyes welling up. He wasn't just leaving his family behind, he was leaving behind a lifetime of memories, a home that no longer existed, and the dreams he and Sophia had once shared. Alejandro glanced at Roberto in the rearview mirror, noticing the old man wiping his eyes with a handkerchief. You okay back there, Papa? He asked, his tone casual but concerned. Roberto quickly stuffed the handkerchief back into his pocket and forced a small nod. I'm just tired. Mariana turned around in her seat and smiled softly at him. We're almost there. You'll feel better soon. Roberto nodded again, his throat tightening. Almost there. The words rang in his ears. Was it a promise of relief or a confirmation of his greatest fear? As the car climbed a winding road surrounded by dense trees, Roberto realized he no longer recognized the area. His heart began to race. There were no houses, no signs of civilization, only the occasional break in the trees where sunlight streamed through the road seemed endless, stretching into a lonely horizon. He swallowed hard, his hands gripping his suitcase tighter. Where are we going? He asked, his voice cracking slightly. You'll see, Alejandro replied cryptically, a faint smile on his lips. Roberto's mind raced with possibilities. Was this road leading to a secluded nursing home far from the city? Was this their way of leaving him behind, out of sight and out of mind? The car eventually slowed, crunching over gravel as it pulled into a clearing. Alejandro killed the engine and turned to face Roberto, his expression unreadable. "We're here, Papa." Roberto hesitated, his body stiff as Alejandro stepped out and opened the back door. He helped Roberto out of the car, guiding him gently as Mariana grabbed the suitcase. Roberto adjusted his glasses, his heart pounding in his chest. He squinted against the sunlight, expecting to see the dull gray facade of a nursing home. Instead, his breath caught in his throat. Before him stood a house he recognized all too well. His house, but it wasn't the charred, blackened skeleton he had last seen. It was fully restored, gleaming as if it had been plucked from his memories and brought back to life. The white paint shimmered under the sunlight. The porch railings were sturdy and new, and the windows sparkled with a clarity that felt surreal. Roberto's knees buckled, and Alejandro quickly caught him. "Careful," he said softly. What is this?" Roberto stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. Alejandro smiled, his eyes glistening. "Welcome home, Papa." As Roberto stood before the gleaming facade of his rebuilt home, his legs wobbled and he clutched Alejandro's arm for support. It wasn't just the house, it was the life it represented, a life he thought had turned to ash along with its wooden beams. He blinked rapidly, trying to convince himself this wasn't a dream come inside. "Papa," Alejandro said gently, leading him toward the porch. Mariana followed, carrying his suitcase. Roberto hesitated for a moment, his fingers brushing over the smooth, freshly painted railing. The smell of pine and varnish filled the air. Each step onto the porch felt surreal, like stepping into a memory that had been resurrected. The front door creaked open, revealing the interior. Roberto gasped. The layout was familiar, yet everything felt new. Polished wood floors, walls painted in soft, warm tones, and furniture that echoed the cozy charm he and Sophia had once created together. On the mantel above the fireplace, a single framed photograph caught his eye. A picture of him and Sophia on their wedding day, their smiles frozen in time. How Roberto's voice broke as he turned to Alejandro. Alejandro gestured for him to sit in his old armchair, restored and reupholstered with the same fabric Sophia had once chosen. "Papa, we never planned to send you to a nursing home," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "We knew how much this house meant to you, so when it burned down, we made it our mission to rebuild it. We couldn't tell you because, well, we wanted it to be a surprise." Mar chimed in, her hand resting on Roberto's shoulder. "You used the land you love so much as the foundation for something new." The neighbors chipped in too. Everyone wanted to help. Alejandro reached into a drawer and pulled out a worn envelope. "Do you remember those papers you signed months ago?" Roberto nodded, his brow furrowing. "You said it was to sell the land." Alejandro shook his head, a small smile playing on his lips. "No, Papa, they were construction permits. We needed your approval to start rebuilding every nail, every beam. It's all for you." Roberto's eyes filled with tears, his breath hitching. "I thought I had lost everything, Sophia, this house, everything." Alejandro handed him a thick photo album, its edges slightly singed, but intact. "Not everything, Papa, look." Roberto's hands trembled as he opened the album. Inside alongside photographs that had survived the fire, pictures of him and Sofia dancing at their anniversary. Alejandro is a baby taking his first steps, and Sofia planting flowers in the garden. The pages smelled faintly of smoke, but the images were vivid, bursting with life. Roberto traced his fingers over a photograph of Sofia holding a basket of freshly picked vegetables, her smile radiant. She loved that garden, he murmured, tears spilling onto the page. Just as he thought his heart couldn't take any more, a familiar sound reached his ears. A gentle whinny echoed from outside, pulling Roberto from his reverie. He froze, his eyes widening as that Alejandro grinned and gestured toward the door. Come and see. Roberto shuffled to the porch, his heart pounding there. Tied to a newly built post near the garden stood Palomo, his beloved horse. The old stallion's coat gleamed in the sunlight, his mane freshly brushed. Roberto's breath caught in his throat as Palomo let out another whinny and stopped the ground as if calling out to him. Roberto exclaimed, tears now flowing freely. He hurried down the steps as fast as his legs could carry him. The horse turned its head, recognizing its old master instantly. Roberto wrapped his arms around Palomo's neck, burying his face in the animal's. Man, you're alive. I thought I'd lost you. To Mariana joined Alejandro on the porch, watching the emotional reunion. We found him a few weeks after the fire, she explained. He'd wandered into the outskirts of town. The neighbors helped care for him until we could bring him back. Roberto stood there for a long moment, his hand gently stroking Palomo's. Man, the warmth of the horse's body, the solid feel of the house behind him, and the presence of his family filled him with a deep, unshakable peace. He turned back to Alejandro, his voice choked with gratitude. You did all of this for me, Roberto asked, his voice trembling. Alejandro nodded. You've done so much for me, Papa. For us, this is just a small way to show you how much we love you. Roberto shook his head, overcome. This isn't small, mio. This is everything. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink, Roberto sat on the porch with Alejandro and Mariana. Palomo grazed peacefully in the yard, and the distant sound of crickets filled the air. Roberto clutched the photo album to his chest, a smile playing on his lips. For the first time in years, he felt whole. His heart, once heavy with loss and loneliness, was now brimming with joy. The home he thought he'd lost forever had been returned to him, not just in bricks and wood, but in love, effort, and family. I was wrong, Roberto said softly, breaking the silence. I thought I was a burden, but you've shown me that I'm anything but. Alejandro reached over and clasped his father's hand. You're not a burden, Papa. You're our foundation. Roberto looked at his son, then at the house, then at Palomo, grazing peacefully. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe it. Overwhelmed with gratitude, Roberto hugged Alejandro tightly. I'm so sorry, mio, he said. I doubted you and thought you didn't care. Alejandro shook his head. You've never been a burden, Papa. We just wanted to give you the home you loved. You deserve it. That evening, Roberto unpacked in his rebuilt home, his heart full for the first time in years, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the newly rebuilt house. Roberto found himself standing in the middle of the living room, his eyes darting from corner to corner. Every detail, every plank, every photograph on the wall spoke of love, dedication, and son's unwavering commitment to his father. Alejandro stood beside him, a quiet smile on his face. Mariana had excused herself to prepare dinner, leaving the two men alone in the space that held decades of memories. Roberto's throat tightened. He turned to Alejandro, his voice trembling. Mio, I don't know what to say. I doubted you. I thought you didn't care, that you wanted to get rid of me. Alejandro's eyes softened and he stepped forward, placing a firm yet gentle hand on his father's shoulder. Papa, you've never been a burden, not once. Everything we did, all the late nights, all the weekends spent building this house, it was all because we love you, because you deserve to be happy. The sincerity in Alejandro's voice was like a balm to Roberto's wounded spirit. Overcome with emotion, Roberto pulled his son into a tight hug. He held on as if letting go would undo everything, as if this embrace could convey the gratitude he couldn't put into words. I'm so sorry, Roberto whispered, his voice muffled against Alejandro's shoulder. I let my fears and loneliness blind me. I should have trusted you. Alejandro pulled back just enough to look his father in the eye. You've done so much for me, Papa. You raised me, loved me, and gave me a life I never would have had without you. This is the least I could do for you. The moment lingered heavy with unspoken words. Alejandro gestured toward the old armchair near the fireplace, the very chair Roberto had spent countless evenings in reading or simply gazing at the stars through the window. Come sit. Papa, there's more. Roberto sat down, his fingers brushing over the armrests. The chair had been re-up, folded dead, but it still carried the same comfort, the same familiarity. Alejandro knelt beside him and reached into his pocket, pulling out a small leather-bound book. This Alejandro began handing it to Roberto as a journal Sophia kept. I found it while sorting through some of the things we managed to save after the fire. Roberto's hand trembled as he opened the journal. The pages were yellowed but intact, filled with Sophia's neat handwriting. As he read, her words seemed to leap off the page, wrapping around him like a warm embrace. She had written about their life together, her love for him and her dreams for their family. She wanted this house to always feel like home. Alejandro said quietly, I thought you should have this so her voice can always be with you. Roberto's vision blurred as tears filled his eyes. Thank you, he choked out. This means everything to me. Later that evening, after dinner, Roberto began unpacking his belongings. Alejandro and Mariana had left him to settle in, promising to return the next day with supplies to help him get started with his garden. As Roberto opened his tea swash over him, he pulled out his. On the mantel, a picture of Sophia. Stage your presence, anchoring the room. Carved wooden bird. Sophia had once original house and a clock that had been. Carried a story, a memory that was now life. As Roberto continued unpacking, his suitcase inside was an envelope he had written weeks ago. During one of had apologized for being a burden and trouble he had caused. A long moment before tearing it into. Softly, Alejandro has shown me that love. Blessings before turning in for the air was cool and fresh. Carrying the Palomo stood grazing nearby, lifting his hand along the horse's man speaking to. We're home, Palomo, Roberto said with a ever imagined. The stars twinkled above windows of the house. For the first time, had thought he had lost everything. His realized he had gained something even deeply and unconditionally. As he walked him, he paused for a moment, listening to. Silence of loneliness. It was the silence of joy as Alejandro and Mariana visited and cared for Palomo, rediscovering that while some elderly parents are abandoned, understanding can create miracles. Biological son, but the bond they shared of family. What do you think of father's home? Instead of sending him to suitcase, he felt a strange sense of old photo frames, placing them carefully, smiling in their garden. Took center. Next he arranged small keepsakes. Gifted him a brass key from in the family for decades. Each item intertwined with this new chapter of his. Came across a small box at the bottom of, addressed to Alejandro. It was a letter. His loneliest nights in Austin. In it he asked Alejandro to forgive him for the. Roberto held the letter in his hands for pieces. No more doubts, he said to himself. Doesn't count burdens, it only counts night. Roberto stepped out onto the porch. Faint scent of earth and wild flowers. Head as Roberto approached. He ran his to him as if they'd never been apart. Smile, and it's better than I could have. Their light mirrored in the glistening. In years Roberto felt truly at peace. He, wife, his home, his purpose, but tonight he, greater the knowledge that he was loved, back and side and closed the door behind. The silence of the house. It wasn't the belonging. The weekends became a time. Regularly Roberto tended to his garden. TC had thought was lost forever, or sent to nursing homes. Love and Alejandro may not have been Roberto's, was unbreakable, a testament to the power. Alejandro's decision to rebuild his nursing home. If you enjoy the story, hit the like and subscribe.